30 years ago, the game library of the Mega Drive was shaken up by the release of a title whose development process was, to put it mildly, anything but smooth. After several months of intense negotiations, under popular pressure and mainly driven by economic imperatives, the Mega Drive version of Capcom's mega hit, Street Fighter II, finally saw the light of day on September 29, 1993. Renamed Street Fighter II-Plus or Street Fighter II, Special Champion Edition in the West, this port was developed by Capcom's internal studios, a first for Mega Drive. It was the first cartridge on the console to reach 24 megabits, a significant detail in an era when every bit mattered. Selling 1.65 million copies worldwide, it became the first Capcom game to exceed 1 million copies sold on a Sega-branded console, a record that would be matched again with Resident Evil Code Veronica on Dreamcast. However, it's necessary to put these numbers into perspective, as they are far behind the sales of Street Fighter II on the Super NES, which leads with 6.3 million copies sold. Nonetheless, it allowed the Mega Drive to catch up with Nintendo, especially in the UK and the US. Despite a resolution lower than the arcades and missing background animations, this Special Champion Edition offers more content than its Super NES counterpart, including a dash mode based on the Champion Edition rules and an Excite mode based on those of the Hyper Fighting, similar to the normal and turbo modes of the Super NES Street Fighter II Turbo. Speed settings go up to 10 stars in Hyper mode, a setting only accessible through a code in the Super NES version. Recurring criticisms point out the game's odd colors. Indeed, the game looks a bit too dark, and the poor quality of the digital voices is undeniable. Strangely, this seems to be less due to technical limitations than to poor programming. A fan supposedly demonstrated that it was possible to improve the sound quality without increasing the ROM size by changing the audio driver. Moreover, Street Fighter II- was indeed designed for the 6-button controller, developed especially for this title, but some digital acrobatics were required to play it on the 3-button one. Contrary to what one might think, Capcom initially didn't have the resources to port the game to Mega Drive in-house. They therefore decided to outsource this port to a third-party developer, under their close supervision. Development began shortly after the agreement was signed in 1992. Capcom and Sega kept the production process and the agreement itself a secret. Only a few weeks later did the press reveal that Street Fighter would be adapted to MD, with a release scheduled for June 1993. The game was to be hosted on a 16-megabit cartridge, and it had been specified from the outset that a special 6-button controller would be produced specifically for it. The announcement of the partnership was probably a shock to Nintendo. The Japanese manufacturer undoubtedly felt betrayed by Capcom, especially since the relationship between the two companies was particularly close at that time. Moreover, for Nintendo, the exclusivity agreement, although temporary, did not only concern the World Warrior but also all upcoming episodes. Capcom and Sega obviously did not have the same interpretation of this clause. This led to a series of complications that delayed the development and marketing of this port. During the conference, Capcom showcased arcade cabinets of Street Fighter II Champion Edition along with a few playable prototypes of the Mega Drive version. Street Fighter was the only game announced at this conference, but more announcements were expected. The game was highly anticipated on Mega Drive for several reasons. The Genesis had a significant market share in the United States, and many gamers at that time owned only one console. The absence of this title thus frustrated a vast base of players. Furthermore, the architecture of the Mega Drive, particularly its Zilog 80 audio processor and its Motorola 68000, which coincidentally were identical to those of the CPS arcade board, promised a faithful adaptation. Initial feedback on this version, then 75% complete, was mostly positive, but some disappointment was palpable. The gameplay seemed faster and more responsive than the Super NES version, but issues such as a mediocre soundtrack, unfinished backgrounds, and a less rich color palette were highlighted. Nevertheless, several reviews emphasized the game's high fidelity to the arcade original, despite the technical concessions, even acknowledging the superiority of the Champion Edition compared to the Super NES version. Shortly after the successful press conference announcing the partnership between Capcom and Sega, Capcom announced the release of Street Fighter II Turbo Hyper Fighting on a 20-megabit cartridge, scheduled for July 11 in Japan, just a month after the Champion Edition's release on MD. The Turbo Hyper Fighting version incorporated all the Champion Edition changes, but also added the speed adjustment popularized by the Rainbow Edition bootleg. The appearance of screenshots in the June '93 issue of the American magazine Video Games and Computer Entertainment was not reassuring. Notably, there was a black bar at the HUD level. The presentation to the press had, to some extent, disappointed fans. The situation worsened when Capcom expressed its discontent with the port's quality, even deciding to halt it midway. Sega, upon hearing this, was naturally furious. Not only was Capcom jeopardizing the strategic title's year-end release, but another contention arose: Hyper Fighting on Super NES was under development for the rival console. At that moment, it was a superior version and was set to be released just a month after theirs. Embarrassed, Capcom quickly proposed a solution. They would develop the Special Champion Edition for Sega, a version that would include all the changes planned for the upcoming Hyper Fighting, along with other minor modifications to give Sega's version a slight edge. Unlike the Champion Edition, which had been programmed by an external contractor, this version would be developed by Capcom Japan themselves, starting from scratch. Moreover, who was behind this beta version? According to the Nostalgia Nerd channel, Minakuchi Engineering, the studio behind Rockman World on MD, was responsible for developing the first version. The sound driver is identical to the one in Rockman World, and the second compelling piece of evidence is the testimony from two key Capcom developers who both, in very similar terms, complained about the poor coding quality by this studio. Debugging sessions for their games were described as a nightmare. However, this hypothesis was rendered obsolete by findings from the Hidden Palace website, which points towards another studio. But we will come back to that a little later. Regardless, this infamous beta, which remained a mystery for many years, resurfaced in 2020 as a playable ROM. The game is recognizable by its now famous black bar behind the HUD and offers graphics that distinguish it from the final version. The animations, sound effects, especially when fighters perform moves, and music are also different. Whatever one's opinion of this beta, far from being disgraceful, Capcom decided to trash it and set its ambitions higher. The game's memory would be increased to reach 24 megabits to include all the promised content. Despite this, the game would be sold at the same price as the Hyper Fighting on Super NES. The sprites were redesigned, and the music and sound effects were completely redone with a new proprietary sound driver. The difference was noticeable, although some regretted the disappearance of certain background animations and the lack of some details. Nevertheless, the Special Champion Edition was well received, with some even considering it the best port, thanks to its dynamism. A year later, Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition became the best-selling fighting game on MD, even surpassing the Hyper Fighting version of the Super NES in sales terms. The war between Sega and Nintendo was at its peak, and in hindsight, it seems that the development and marketing of Street Fighter II were one of the main battles. It's incredible to think that Capcom decided to completely overhaul the project less than 6 months before its release. Its internal team managed to reprogram SF2 Champion Edition in record time, with a 24 megabit cartridge instead of the initially planned 16. Hats off to the artist and happy anniversary. But a mystery remains. On June 2, 1994, a group of developers named The Boss uploaded a mysterious file titled BSSF2U.LZH to several pirate forums. Titled SF2 Turbo, it appeared to be a bootleg of Capcom's famous hit. However, it was an impressively complete and well-executed bootleg, though far from finalized. The game featured 12 playable characters and alternate costumes, unlockable by pressing the start button. 8 difficulty levels were available, and an options screen allowed for 6-button controller configuration. Strangely, this pseudo-bootleg provided more animation frames for fighters than the official version, contrary to magazine reports that mentioned missing animations. The colors seemed closer to the arcade version, and the sound effects and digitized voices were clearer. However, some of them were missing. Moreover, the game could be completed with any character, including ending sequences. But where did this mysterious version come from? The first hypothesis is that it might be a highly sophisticated hack created by talented developers. This idea is met with skepticism by experts because modifying a game without access to its source code is challenging, with hacks usually involving only marginal changes. The second hypothesis, put forward by the Hidden Palace website, seems more plausible. According to them, an analysis of old promotional videos leaves little doubt about its origin. It's a more advanced version of the beta presented to the press. The pseudo-bootleg's music tracks can be identified in the promotional video. Regarding the game's origin, several clues point to the Japanese studio Opera House, specializing in outsourcing. Analyzing the sound drivers and the ROM decompression routines reveals similarities with several titles developed by this studio. The most likely explanation is that the ROM comes from a more advanced beta version than the one presented at the time, passed on to someone in the industry or to magazines. Though no certainty exists on this matter. Regardless, some Sega fans, impressed by the quality of this beta, have wondered if Capcom deliberately sacrificed it so as not to jeopardize its relationship with Nintendo.